Thank you. No problem. Does this work? Can you hear me? Thanks for the inspiring introduction. So I'll do this myself. I'm Ethan Buchman. I'm a co-founder of the Cosmos and Tendermint projects, and I wear many hats. I don't live in Berlin, and I'm not associated with the Web3 Foundation, though I'm very interested in what they're doing. I wear many hats, but these days I work primarily for the Interchain Foundation, which is a Swiss nonprofit with a mission to support research and development in open and decentralized networks. And we do that because we believe that open source, cryptographic, consensus-driven economic networks really hold the key to an anti-fragile global economic system and equal opportunity for all. And of course, that's what we all claim to be in this for. Whether or not that's true remains to be seen. And so, if you've been following, you probably know that the Interchain Foundation is especially interested in a particular blockchain project, that being the Cosmos project, or the Cosmos network, which is one of these projects aiming to bring us towards this like interchain ecosystem, right? They're pursuing interoperability between many different kinds of blockchains in the same way that the internet brought interoperability between many different networks. This perceived or future interchain vision is about bringing interoperability to the many different blockchains. And I think what kind of differentiates Cosmos from others in the space is this focus on sovereignty and on building tools that enable communities and individuals and developers and people to build networks and to build systems that represent them, that represent their values, that represent their actual stake, right? And so, if you've also been paying attention, you probably know that the first blockchain in the Cosmos network launched as of 6 weeks ago, so that's the Cosmos Hub, and this is, the first of what will hopefully be many, many blockchains to launch in this network, and, obviously I'm, proud and excited to have played a role in that and to be able to represent Toronto on that. Go Toronto, woo. And so you might think, all right, well, this guy's been working on this project for like the last 4 years, their blockchain just launched, he's gonna get up here and chill Cosmos for the next 30 minutes. Well, I'm gonna do nothing of the sort. I'm probably not gonna talk much about Cosmos at all. Instead, what I'm gonna tell you about is more or less my general understanding of our shared reality. And I'm gonna hope that's relevant to you and relevant to me and maybe relevant to other people building on this. And I will warn you that this is a new talk. I've been working on it for the last week, basically, and I've never given it before. And it's highly experimental. So I'm still learning from it, and even myself, I'm still learning what I'm even talking about. So, it'll be a little bit intuitive, maybe a little bit romantic, a little bit poetic, and hopefully people out there with more kind of rigorous scientific backgrounds might glean some insights from it and take it in a better, more substantial direction than I can. So, okay, let's get to the point here. Stakeholders and state machines, right? It might equivalently be called state machines and stakeholders. I think it is in the schedule. And the reason for that is there's this kind of recursion between these two things, right? Something that's a state machine at one level can be a stakeholder at another, and so on, right? And we could think about this conference as kind of a primary example. We have a bunch of stakeholders. We have speakers like myself, audience members like yourselves, the organizers of the conference who have done fantastic job putting this thing together, and that we have the venue and so on. So all these stakeholders who have something at stake, something they care about, right? Something that matters to them. And they're coordinating to achieve something that's kind of greater than the sum of their parts, right? In this case, it's a conference. And this conference is a state machine in the sense that it has some state, and it has rules for how the state transitions over time, for how it processes inputs and turns them into outputs. And the point of that state machine is to kind of represent the interests of the stakeholders and to achieve something for the benefit of the stakeholders, right? And so you might think of the state here of this conference has to do with the location, where it is, the timing, the date, the schedule here. There's a set of rules like, no smoking inside, no shilling shitcoins unless they're built on Aeon or Cosmos or Polkadot, and so on and so forth, right? And so that's kind of the structure of the thing. Great. But when we think about, what are kind of the dominant forms, the dominant structures we use for creating state machines that represent stakeholders, the main thing is really the corporation, right? The corporation is kind of an entity, a structure or form that's been around for, hundreds of years, where, you have a state machine, the corporation itself, right? It's stateful, it has, the state of its books, its financial records, it has inventory, employees, directors, et cetera, and then it has stakeholders, right? And what's interesting about a corporation is the only stakeholders it actually represents directly in the state are the shareholders, right? The shareholders are the people who have some kind of like financial interest in the corporation, and the corporation has a duty to make a financial return for the shareholders, right? But obviously, people have been starting to recognize that there's many more stakeholders than just the shareholders, right? And part of the problem here is that the corporation insufficiently represents that larger group of stakeholders, right? And so now there's this whole movement to like destroy shareholder-based capitalism and, gives people meaning. They get up in the morning and, let's destroy the patriarchy, and they'll feel that if you're not dedicating your life to destroying shareholder capitalism, then like, what are you even doing, right? And so, okay, it's a reasonable position. And so some of us are exploring alternatives, right? And so, a nonprofit foundation like the Interchain Foundation is an example of this. It has no shareholders, there's no equity, there's no one to whom it has an obligation to return, to make a financial return. It's set up to represent a much larger group of stakeholders. In this case, the community of people building and participating in open decentralized networks. Oh, there's a thing here, great. So here's another example. This is the corporate group for IKEA. What's interesting about IKEA, especially from the perspective of people in cryptocurrency, is that they're governed by not one but two nonprofit European foundations. Maybe you didn't know that, but at the very top here, there's two nonprofit foundations, and this whole thing was set up, for God knows what reason exactly, but to somehow better represent the stakeholders in this ecosystem than could be done using the shareholder model, right? And so kind of this problem with the shareholder capitalism that it insufficiently represents everyone. And so there are other alternatives to your two nonprofit European foundations. You can do things like cooperatives, right? Cooperative corporation, which are kind of becoming increasingly popular again. And it's well known that cooperatives tend to be much more sustainable than corporations, right? The average lifetime is, I think, maybe like 10 years longer or something like this. But people will often argue that in a cooperative, right, a cooperative is something that doesn't have shareholders the same way. It has members, and every member gets one vote, and it's kind of democratically governed. And people will often argue that because of that, there's a lot more deadlock, and it's a lot harder to get things done, and corporations are often a lot more innovative because they have this kind of top-down, dictator-like control, and the crazy entrepreneur can go out and do something nuts, like try to launch a public blockchain network or God knows what, build Juicero, And so, but it seems to me that this might be true. Corporations are definitely more innovative, and it seems, co-ops are definitely more sustainable, but it seems we've kind of overshot on the innovation front. And in some sense, there's like too many corporations and they're innovating too quickly, and they're doing it on an insufficiently stable foundation, right? And we might be much better off, and the innovation coming out of corporations might be much better received if it was based on a more sustainable foundation of, say, more co-ops providing more of our basic services, right? And it's nothing to be ashamed of to be part of a co-op and not, an innovative corporation, say, right? We just don't seem to have the right balance. That said, there's also this problem with corporations today in that, they can be incredibly complex, and understanding the rules of the corporate state machine is very difficult, right? You have to read the Income Tax Act and the corporate regulations and all this kind of crap. And at the end of the day, you kind of just want to know, what is the state of my corporation? What state is it in? You want to query for it. You want to get some result. The same way you have a database, you send a query, you get a result. And the way you do that today with corporations is you call up your accountants and lawyers and you pay them thousands of dollars to tell you things, and they usually get it wrong at least a few times, right? And then you have to deal with penalties and so on. This is just kind of what everyone has accepted. And to me, this is fundamentally unacceptable, and all of you should be ashamed of yourselves, especially those of you who have been building corporations in Silicon Valley for the last 30 years and have not addressed this problem, right? Because for some reason, for you, it's acceptable to have corporations in completely invalid states where you can't query them and you don't know anything about them, right? And so this is why I'm more or less dedicating my life and my work to this problem of the open source digital representation of corporate state. Right? Mind-blowing, right? We should be able to manage and run our corporations the way we manage and run our software. And anything short of that is unacceptable and disgusting, okay? Now, so I'm building an army to pursue this problem, and I encourage you to join this army. If you don't think this problem matters or you're not interested, you're basically dead to me. No, not actually. It's okay, there's a lot of good reasons, to not care too much about this, but obviously this is something that matters quite a bit to me as someone who's increasingly involved in corporations and increasingly frustrated that all the lawyers and accountants seem to disagree and to give you the wrong answer and to not really know because, the state of the corporation isn't executable the way software is. It doesn't, you can't really program it, right? And you can't query it easily. So this is something we're working on. There's this philosophy I want to point out called plain text accounting, which is this idea that you can do all your accounting, full-on double-entry bookkeeping in plain text. Plain text that is readable by both humans and machines. And by using something like this, you can avoid having to fork out hundreds of dollars to criminal corporations like Intuit who spend their time lobbying the government to make filing taxes as difficult as possible. That's what their business model rests on. Why? Because they have shareholders, right? Starting to follow? Okay. So there's this tool called bean count, which is an implementation of this plain text accounting philosophy, which I think is totally wonderful. It's one of my favorite tools. I strongly recommend you look into it. I've been using it for my personal and Canadian corporate accounting for the last couple of years. And like I said, I'm hoping to marshal the resources of whatever entity happens to be willing to employ me at any given time towards pursuing this and making this available to everyone so that we can all get over the ridiculousness of the current state of kind of corporate affairs and manage things in a nice, transparent, open source, accessible manner. Okay, back to the regularly scheduled programming. Stakeholders and state machines. So this is a slide I've been using actually for a couple of years, where I usually use it in the context of like distributed state. Because what we're seeing here is a few different examples of where you have kind of stateful information distributed kind of over a set of agents in a way that tries to make it fault tolerant and persistent, right? And this is kind of fundamental to what we're doing in the blockchain space, these like fault tolerant state machines, right? That's really what it's all about. But I think what I missed when I was constantly talking about distributed state is this idea of the stakeholder, right? The stakeholders that actually care about the state machine and that are involved in running the state machine and that are affected by the outcome of the state machine, right? And that's really what it's all about. And when you start to think about the world in terms of like stakeholders and state machines, you start to see them everywhere, right? And you start to like look at what are the different levels at which a state machine might exist or at which stakeholders are represented, right? And maybe at one level of analysis, certain stakeholders are represented, and it kind of varies as you go across the different levels in different state machines, right? And so, and you get this recursion, as kind of I mentioned earlier, where, you might have the Rebuild Conference, which is a state machine that we're all kind of creating as stakeholders, but the Rebuild Conference is itself a stakeholder in the larger state machine of Toronto Blockchain Week. And Toronto Blockchain Week's a stakeholder in the larger state machine of kind of the global blockchain weeks, and so on. But, okay, so, why do we need to do this? Why do we care so much about these state machines and about having all these stakeholders, like, coordinate to create state machines to do things, right? And it's fundamentally because it's stakeholders and state machines against the world, right? We live in a highly adversarial, hostile world where everything is kind of running down, right? For every database, you have a corrupt hard drive. For every murmuration of starlings, you have an island of dead birds. For every bridge made in advance, you have an anteater. For the rule of law, you have a guy like the Joker. Why he's so serious, For a nice soccer game, you have a naked fan running across the field. For a handshake deal, you have someone crossing their fingers. And for a nice legislative assembly, you have this scene from Run the Jewels, Nobody Speak. Where, and some of our, I think some other legislative assemblies turn into this in the real world too, right? So this is what we're up against. This is what we're trying to protect ourselves from. We're trying to coordinate to sustain ourselves, to, pursue our stake, right? In the face of this kind of rampant adversarial breakdown, right? And it's like the universe, this is what the universe does. It kind of dissipates things, it runs things down, right? And this is typically known as the second law of thermodynamics. You might know that in the form of like, oh, entropy is always increasing, where entropy is somehow this notion of like disorder or disorganization. I don't really like that phrasing too much. I prefer the idea that the universe is running down gradients, right? So when gradients build up, some kind of heterogeneity in the world, it's in the universe's interest, it's driven to actually run those things down, right? And so you get this kind of classic phenomenon of dissipation. And this is really what the universe is doing everywhere. This is the nature of time itself, is to run down gradients, right? And so you have this classic example of a hot coffee cup in a colder room, and what happens? Well, the heat dissipates. It runs down over time. And nobody questions this. Nobody thinks anything about this. This is just, normal operation of the universe. Of course, when it comes to, me explaining my general understanding of our shared reality, this thing is kind of fundamental. And every time I stare at the coffee cup, I wonder, will it not run down this time? Of course, every time it does, I put it in the thermos, lasts a little longer. What's super interesting about dissipation, about this dissipation problem, is that under the right conditions, you end up with something a little more interesting. You get emergent structure, right? So these are still, these phenomena of the whirlpool and the tornado and the hurricane, it's still fundamentally dissipating a gradient, right? But what's happened here is the context of the gradient is such that the emergence of this structure enables the gradient to be dissipated actually faster, right? And so the organized structure that exists here, which might seem to kind of contradict the second law of thermodynamics, like, oh, where's this structure from? Why did the universe spontaneously create something cool, right? It's because it actually serves this interest of better running down the gradient. And I've kind of developed this notion that most of the interesting things that happen in the world are just like fancy ways for water to get around. And I really like this idea that actually human beings were invented by water as a device for transporting itself from one place to another, right? And so, and I mean that. I mean it very seriously because, we could, maybe this is a little bit, maybe it's silly, maybe I don't mean it too seriously, it's a little bit romantic, but we could think about these things as state machines, right? Each of the tornado has a state, has a velocity, it has a size, it's got a composition, right? And who are the stakeholders that it represents? I'm not sure exactly. The atmosphere, the winds, the temperature, the water, whatever. But what's interesting about these structures is that they emerge spontaneously, they have this kind of spontaneous order, they're running things down, but they only seem to have activation. They can only go forward, right? They have no inhibitory capacity. They can't like prevent them, they can't like, be like, oh, there's a bunny, I'm not gonna, tornado through the bunny, they just tornado through everything, right? And so I think of that in the context of like state machines as if these state machines don't have the capacity to represent their own boundaries, right? And so if they can't represent their own boundaries, they can't avoid their boundaries. And so they're kind of destined to wear themselves out, right? They run themselves down. The hurricane crashes into land, and then it's over. The hurricane doesn't get to like avoid land and try to make itself last forever, right? And so we can model this kind of schematically like this, right? This is like basically an energy flow diagram. You have energy kind of spiraling out in every single direction all at once, right? This diagram I actually pulled from a book called The Rainbow and the Worm. It's one of my favorite books. I highly recommend it. There's a lot of kind of magic and mysticism in there, but it's actually written by a very well-known biochemist who's trying to explore kind of the physics of the organism and really set the foundation for a lot of my understanding about organisms as sustainable systems or sustainable systems as organisms. And in this image, he was actually talking about our economic system, right? And how our economic systems really kind of resemble hurricanes. They're just dissipating gradients in every single direction all at once as fast as they can in a way that is completely oblivious to their boundaries, right? In the same way the hurricane can't represent its boundary, the state machine of our economic system is incapable of representing its boundary. It's not really aware, it seems, that it's on a finite planet, it has finite resources, and needs to match the rate of consumption with the rate of output, right? And these things further, they don't really represent how their outputs feed back on them, right? And so, when we're building systems and we're building economic systems, we really need to think to ourselves, are we building hurricanes? And if so, we should probably stop and build something else, right? Okay, what is that something else? I think it looks a little bit more like this. Again, this is a diagram from The Rainbow and the Worm. And the idea here is instead of kind of spiraling this energy flow out in every direction and dissipating in every direction, the key is to create cyclic loops of energy flow, right? It's still a dissipative structure. It's still running down gradients. It doesn't contravene the second law. In fact, the existence of these things is really to further the dissipation that is kind of, necessitated by the second law. But the way it does it here, instead of spiraling in every direction, it builds these closed energy loops, right? And the cool thing about organisms is they seem to have this kind of energy storage, this cyclic energy storage at kind of every level of the organism. And that's really powerful because what it means is this energy becomes available for the organism as it needs it. And it's able to use it to respond in many different contexts, right? And so, of course, we have, here a few kind of classic examples of organisms. We have a toadstool, we have a lotus flower, a jellyfish, and, all of these organisms manage to store up energy internally in kind of cyclic flows that they can then use as needed to respond to changes in their environment. And the existence of these stored forms of energy come to represent the environment, almost kind of literally, right? I mean, the organisms tend to have a lot of sensory apparatus, right? They have vision or smell or taste or whatever, at least for animals, and plants have different kinds of things. And they use that sensory apparatus to build up kind of an internal representation of the world, right? And again, you can think of these things as state machines, right? That they have some internal state, they process inputs, they generate outputs, and maybe the stakeholders are the various biogeochemical cycles that feed into them and that coordinate to kind of create them, right? Why and what they represent and what everyone's trying to achieve, I don't really know necessarily, other than this furthering this cause of dissipation. But what's kind of seemingly fundamental about these things is that these cycles of energy flow, they kind of build up in layers, right? And you start from a lower, kind of more fundamental layer, looking at the cycles of the sun. The sun rises and sets every day. That's a pretty reliable foundation, The seasons change on the kind of this quarterly basis, right? The water cycle is a pretty reliable cycle. The nitrogen cycle, things like this, right? And on top of these more fundamental base cycles, they build out much more advanced, much more acute and precise representations of their immediate environment. Things like, their hormonal cycles or their sexual selection cycles or the songs the bird sings, right? It's very particular to the species of bird, and it represents something specific about their environment, but it's layered on top of all of these more fundamental flows, right? And so this suggests a new way to kind of approach growth, right? We often think of our economic system as this like infinite growth system, and everyone's like, oh, we need to be able to grow. What happens if we stop growing? A tragedy will befall us. I mean, tragedy is going to befall us on the current rate when we crash into land, whatever that might be with our current hurricane. But what this proposes is that there's another approach to growth, which is to layer more of these kind of cyclic flows of energy on top of each other in ways that kind of coordinate, right? And so you might start with a simple system that only has a few of these flows, and you can start to layer on more and more of them that are kind of representative of more particular things in the environment, right? right? And this allows the system to grow, but to grow in a sustainable way, in a way that continues to represent its boundaries, continues to represent its relationship with the external world, right? And so when we're building these systems today, these blockchain systems, these economic systems, and so on, it behooves us to kind of keep this sort of thinking in mind. Are we building a hurricane, or are we building kind of cyclic flows of energy? Of course, ultimately, wow. When I practiced this, I was like at 30 minutes by now. So I'm either talking super fast or like forgetting a bunch of stuff. But apparently I still have 10 minutes. So kind of the climax of all of this is, of course, the forest ecosystem, right? And this all comes together into like a climax for us. And we all know the forest doesn't just appear all at once, right? You learn in elementary school or high school that there's this kind of succession, right? Of, starts with like lichens colonizing rock and turns things into soil, and then small plants grow and they get into bigger plants, and eventually you get this climax structure, right? And so, the approach we've been taking, or that we've been thinking about when we design our technology, is that it should work the same kind of way. The technology should first and foremost represent the smallest communities, the smallest individuals, and that it should work for them and be flexible for them so that they can be kind of sovereign in their own right and represent the things in their state machines that actually matter to them, right? And that somehow, through having many of these, we'll find ways to compose them into a global, system on the order of a forest. And so this is what we're working towards in our kind of design of blockchain systems. Now, we've been talking about dissipation, sustainable structures, and so on. Kind of leads naturally, or begs the question of like, okay, how does this all relate to the blockchain systems and the kind of energy structures that are in there? And of course, the first thing that comes to mind tends to be proof of work, right? And proof of work is almost comedically dissipative, right? It's like the only thing it does is dissipate energy in a way that everyone presumes is somehow fundamentally wasteful. But I see that and I question, is it any more wasteful than the shining of the sun? Right? Is the fact that the sun shines wasteful? Certainly it dissipates a lot of heat. Certainly it's burning a lot of nuclear fuel that maybe could have been put to other uses. We could have used the sun's energy to do something else instead of shining all this light. We're not even using all the light, right? And so in the same way that the sun kind of provides this base, low-level, dissipative structure, right? Maybe proof of work provides a similar thing. And proof of work isn't in and of itself necessarily, wasteful or unsustainable, but it actually could somehow become part or a foundation of a sustainable system and of a layering of energy cycles that give us kind of organisms in this digital world, right? And so now I've kind of noticed this trajectory, so to speak, of systems going from a global to a local level, right? And so proof of work is this kind of very simple system where the only thing it really represents in the state machine is kind of the global availability of electrical energy, right? This is all that matters to proof of work. So long as there's available electricity and, chips, very simple chips, proof of work can continue to work and anyone can participate and it doesn't require any kind of permission or any knowledge of anything else really, right? But we can kind of go from this kind of global, anonymous, highly dissipative system and what we're looking to do is kind of step down from that towards something that's much more local and much more in tune with the needs of individuals and that actually represents what matters to them, right? And so it's like the end goal is state machines that represent local communities and the services that those communities rely on and the production of food and housing and, sewage and electricity and so on, right? At a local level, right? And so as we step down from this kind of, from this global, highly dissipative, somewhat objective phenomenon of proof of work, we get towards things like proof of stake, where instead of, dissipative mining, we have this kind of key signing thing, right? And even though the proof of stake systems might still be global, they have a lot more kind of identifying information in them. There's a lot more, and there's certainly more subjectivity, kind of by design. Anyone who's familiar with the security of proof of stake knows about the long-term nothing at stake problem and the need for subjectivity that's required in a way that's not required in proof of work. And so it's almost like as we move from, more objective to more subjective systems, we kind of introduce this additional requirement of locality, right? That the systems somehow become closer to the users, closer to the individuals that are using them. And with proof of stake, you have all these validators standing up that are coming to self-identify themselves and say, hey, I'm such and such an entity, and these are the people that work for us, and this is the setup we have in our infrastructure, and this stuff actually matters to people, right? And they look, and when they participate, they go do their due diligence in a very different way than with a miner. With a miner, you don't actually care. It's just, do you have electricity? Yes, and that's it, right? With proof of stake, there's a lot more to it. Do you have a high availability server? Do you have a secure key? Do you have failover? all this kind of stuff. From proof of stake, we might step down again to, say, a proof of bandwidth system, right? Where we're talking about providing networking to a local community, say mesh nets. And this again adds an element of subjectivity and kind of requires another element of locality, right? Where it doesn't leave the same kind of persistent footprint on the world that proof of work does in the form of hashes, or that proof of stake does in the form of signatures. Proof of bandwidth, like, it's kind of hard to show that it happened later, unless you have this more subjective and local element, right? And finally, we're trying to get to basically proof of produce, where we can somehow recognize more fundamentally in our economic state machines the value of the people that are providing the basic necessities that sustain us in the first place, right? I mean, when you think about farmers and nurses and teachers and elder care and kind of all the basic things that make that make it possible to have a society in the first place, they're completely neglected by the economic structures we have in place, right? They're not represented adequately in the state machines, and this is what we're all working towards, right? Of course, you're always going to have bugs in the system, right? In this case, we have quite literally Bugs Bunny picks up my carrot and eats it. And this is something we constantly have to deal with, right? The impact of the kind of messiness of the human relationship with the system, right? And that's not really going away. And so what I'll do now is just briefly kind of take you through, this used to be a whole 30-minute talk. I've now compressed it into 2 slides and put it at the end, and I'm fortunate to still have a few minutes to go through it. This kind of history of stakeholders and state machines in the human domain, and where I think it ends and what's coming next, right? And so we kind of have this, there's I think a really nice analogy between how these systems have evolved in the geopolitical domain and how they've evolved in the digital network domain, right? And so in the geopolitical domain, we kind of started with city-states, villages and city-states, right? Where everyone kind of knew each other, things were kind of self-sufficient, right? It was relatively simple state machine that everyone kind of understood and could participate in, but there was no real contact with the outside world. Everything outside the city-state or outside the village was somehow hostile or unknown, whatever, right? And then we move into the age of empires, right? Of somebody else's government, right? Where Alexander the Great steps in and says, okay, now you're part of my empire, and you no longer do things maybe the way you did before. You now have to pay taxes to me, and you have to participate in my military, and you have to kind of give up a lot of your sovereignty to Alexander's empire. But at the same time, you get these new benefits. Alexander's going to protect you. He's going to give you accessibility to trade. You can now import spices from India or from wherever, right? And so there's this kind of trade-off there. But what happens is ultimately the state machine of Alexander's empire insufficiently represents the stakeholders, right? And it wasn't just Alexander's, it was all the empires that came. And so you get this rumbling underneath, right? Where we're saying, the state machine doesn't represent us anymore, and eventually you have a revolution, you overthrow the king, and you invent the idea of a nation state, right? Which is a little bit smaller than a global empire, but somehow better represents the stakeholders that are participating, right? And becomes this state machine like the rule of law and our democracy and so on, and this kind of cascaded across the world, and all the empires have been replaced with nation states, right? But it seems that the nation states have gotten so big and complex that the same thing is kind of happening again, right? The state machine of the nation state insufficiently represents the stakeholders of its population, right? It's too big of a geopolitical area for a single state machine to sufficiently represent. And so there's all this agitation again, right? And so there's this question, well, what's coming next? So on the digital network side, we had the same kind of story, right? Instead of villages and city-states, we had, my computer and the intranet. These are like relatively small, self-contained systems. Is the clock going too slow or something? No? I don't know how I still have time. It's amazing. So you have these kind of self-contained systems. They don't really talk to the outside world. They're pretty self-sufficient, right? And then you move into the era, instead of somebody else's government, you have somebody else's computers, right? Also known as the cloud. And we have Jeff Bezos instead of Alexander the Great. He's arguably the Alexander the Great of our time, hopefully a benevolent dictator, but certainly, a dictator nonetheless. And again, you have this kind of sovereignty trade-off. He steps in, he says, use my computers instead, upload your stuff to my cloud, I'll take care of everything, but, you have to pay me, and if we don't like you, we can shut you down, right? And you're kind of stuck with that, and you have that trade-off. And eventually, there's all this rumbling underneath, and the state machine of Amazon and Amazon Web Services insufficiently represents the stakeholders of the people that want to use the internet. And groups come together and they say, well, no, we're going to rebel against that. We're going to overthrow the king. Fortunately, we haven't killed anyone, which is good. But we create a new kind of sovereign digital network, which is the equivalent of the nation state, right? In the digital realm. And these are things like Bitcoin and Ethereum and Dogecoin and so on and so forth. And all of these are kind of independent, sovereign entities that have new state machines that are a little bit more democratic than what came before them, right? And they have, some large group of stakeholders that they represent. And each one kind of has a different culture, right? Like Bitcoin is this anarcho-libertarian money, and Ethereum is this like avant-garde experiment in computation and mechanism design, and Dogecoin is like a testament to the capacity of silliness to, send bobsled teams to the Olympics and, whatever. And of course, we have like Potcoin, which solved the Korea crisis, right? It's amazing. In case you don't know, Potcoin funded Dennis Rodman, who's Kim Jong-un's buddy, to like go there and broker peace. So it's amazing what these things can do if you just like let some sovereignty emerge, right? People can like really act and behave and do amazing things. But we're starting to have the same kind of agitation is happening again. These state machines of Bitcoin and Ethereum, as we've already seen, are the stakeholder base is too varied and too diversified and too complex to be represented by a single state machine. And both Ethereum and Bitcoin have actually split, right? They both forked in two. And now we have Bitcoin Cash, right? And we also have Ethereum Classic, right? And they split over some fundamental issue. And now again, we're having all these governance debates and trying to figure out how do we marshal this massively diverse group of stakeholders into a common state machine. It's very, very difficult. No wonder, because the stakeholder group is so massive and varied, right? And so it's like, well, so what comes next? Well, I'll tell you what I think comes next. Something like this, right? Networks of community currencies, something that are much more local, that provide much more sovereignty to the user base, that allow users to actually, and communities to represent their values at a much more local level with a stakeholder group that is diverse locally, right? But not as diverse as like a fully global set of the entire population. That's too big of a stakeholder group to represent with a single state machine unless it's a very, very low level one, like proof of work and Bitcoin might be, right? And so the idea here is that the technology we're building is to enable this kind of self-sufficient sovereignty to emerge, in a kind of bottom-up approach, and to then compose together into a global network of, sustainable utopia. Amen. Thank you.